and welcome to the Unreal Engine News and Community Spotlight. Nickelodeon debuted Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles VR interview experience at San Diego Comic-Con 2018, where users could step inside the world of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to conduct a live interview with the cast of Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in virtual reality. This one-of-a-kind interview allowed users to have a conversation with Mikey or Donnie, voiced live on the scene by series voice talent Brandon Michael Smith and Josh Brainer, respectively. Read our full interview with Chris Young, Entertainment Lab Senior VP at Nickelodeon, to get the inside scoop on his inspiration and process. Project Polish Productions, a team of graduate students at the Florida Interactive Entertainment Academy, recently completed their capstone game Hollowed, a side-scrolling puzzle platformer in which you follow the story of a woman who will do anything to bring her perished loved one back to life. With high stakes, the ever-looming possibility of having the project cut in its entirety, the team set out to make a polished game that could be released and viewed as more of an indie game rather than a student game. Learn more about Hollowed and its evolutions in design, art style, gameplay, and more on our blog linked below. The Unreal Dev Grant Program, a $5 million development fund created by Epic back in 2015, provides a no-strings-attached monetary boost given out to select developers and creators every year. Among the winners of the inaugural offering was Adrian Lazar and his ambitious project, Planet Alpha. Crediting the honor with being the catalyst he needed to turn his part-time passion project into a full-time development studio, Adrian is on the precipice of releasing Planet Alpha for PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch on September 4th, 2018. Employing a unique mechanic of controlling the cycle of day to night and back again, Planet Alpha is a mixed bag of quick platforming, puzzle solving, and stealth mechanics. Colorful environments brought to life by Unreal Engine 4 will see players tackle everything from lush forests alive with organisms of all sizes, mysterious caverns rife with danger, and magical skyborne lands, complete with massive flying creatures of myth and legend. It's a visual feast that's full of life at every turn. As the title prepares for launch, we caught up with Adrian to learn more about Planet Alpha's growth from being a personal project to becoming a highly anticipated initial offering for a newly found studio. Dive into our interview, where Adrian imparts his advice on what burgeoning developers should learn and tells us about the tools in Unreal Engine 4 that served the studio best over the past 4 years. With SIGGRAPH 2018 just around the corner, we're thrilled to be able to share the latest cutting-edge Unreal Engine developments and showcase some of the amazing projects our dedicated enterprise users are building with our real-time platform. If you'll be at the expo, find us at booth 1401. We'll be there with lots of demos and enterprise customer guest speakers. But we also don't want you to miss out on the info-packed day of tech talks the Unreal team has put together for you. We have a full day of tech talks, including real-time ray tracing advances in Unreal Engine, Fortnite, advancing the animation production pipeline, and real-time motion capture in Unreal Engine. Find more about all of our tech talks and our overall presence at SIGGRAPH on the SIGGRAPH events page. From a realistic military FPS to a stunning loft design and a metaphysical narrative adventure, July's Nvidia Edge recipients set out to impress. Scheduled to release in September, Zero Caliber is an incredibly realistic military FPS developed exclusively for VR by the team at Xreal Games. If you'd like to jump in on the action now, visit their Discord channel to participate in their alpha tests. Stephen Brackey brought to life a small studio loft design, other really incredible projects. And set in an indeterminate future, The Crossing leads players on a metaphysical journey about existence. The narrative adventure, in development by Concow Studio, leverages machine learning for its procedural environments. So congrats to all this month's recipients, who will each be receiving an Nvidia GTX 1080 Ti, generously provided by our partner at Nvidia. If you'd like a chance at taking home one as well, be sure to enter your projects for August. More details at unrealengine.com/NvidiaEdge. During GDC 2018, Epic Games released over 20 AAA quality characters and more than 1,500 environment components from Paragon to the development community for free. This week, we've updated all the character assets currently available on the Unreal Engine Marketplace to include animation blueprints, making it even easier to implement and utilize these characters. If you haven't already taken advantage of these assets, lead animator Jay Hosfeld joined the Unreal Engine live stream for a series dedicated to work in animation blueprints. Over the course of the live streams, he walked through retargeting animations, adding a strafe locomotion system, and blend spaces, and utilizing sync markers, creating additive animation, and even more, with future streams to come. And more character assets with their animation blueprints will become available in the future. So onto our weekly karma. These folks are jumping in and helping their fellow devs. So we'd like to give a huge shout out to Everynone, Svitar, Shadow River, Mighty Enigma, Redbox, Dijo, Indie Game Cove, Null Hoge, Ihiol Poter, and Chopin Dev. Thank you all so very much. So on to our community spotlight. Our first spotlight this week is a game called Photonic Distress. So it's a blend of first and third person puzzle platformer with a unique twist. You navigate your way through randomly generated dark levels, lighting your way up and collecting memory fragments to wake up. It's been developed by a small team over the last 2 years. The game looks really fantastic, and I just love the different visual and gameplay effects that they've used to leverage the game. So great work to that team. Our second community spotlight is called The King's Bedroom. So inspired to create something that was both architectural and overgrown, Noah leaned into Uncharted style for the foliage and colors, and Versailles for the architecture and aesthetic. He's done a wonderful job of setting the mood with the scene here. The original concept was by Pace Wilder, so great job there. Just is a fantastic piece and scene overall. It's a great work by Noah. Our third and final piece is called Help Me Escape. So the premise is, there's been a kidnapping. The victim has awoken in a bizarre office filled with curiosities and cannot find a way out. There's a mobile phone on the desk which has no reception, but a single contact number in it. Yours. Will you answer a text from an unknown number? A complete stranger? They need your help, and you are their only hope. Will you disrupt the kidnappers' plans and help them to escape? Help Me Escape looks absolutely fantastic, and with hopes to release this summer, they're also looking for beta testers. So if you head over to their site, you can sign up if you're interested in helping them out. All right, thank you for joining us for our news and community spotlight. Hi, and welcome to our Unreal Engine live stream. I'm your host, Amanda Bott, and with me we have Paulo, all the way from Brazil. He's our evangelist, so thank you for calling in. And then we also have Sam Deiter, our senior technical writer, and Ben Zeigler, a technical lead. So you all and a team worked on Action RPG, correct?
Yes. So myself, along with Paulo, Ben, Jim Brown, and a couple other people from Epic, all basically took Action RPG. We had the initial, we needed to get a sample out that showed how to use the ability system. And Action RPG was something that the evangelism team had been using in the past, but it was kind of spread around all over the place. So what we did is we took it from a prototype state. We took the heaviest system, which is the ability system, Ben brought that system into C++, and then we released the sample as it is. Now, there are some improvements the sample needs to have. The player controller / player blueprint architecture, we can refactor some things in there, add more abilities and weapons. You know, but this was built kind of how a game goes. It goes from a prototype to you take the heaviest systems, you put them in C++. Once you have that work done, then you polish the rest of the game. So we're at the second phase of polishing this game. Right. So, yeah, it's a really, really great sample. You're going to learn a lot. I don't know, Paulo, you got anything else you'd like to add?
We have used Unreal building AI systems for for to feed the game, of course, to build the AI for the enemies. This is really simple AI. It's not complex at all. To try to serve the purpose of a learning resource. But it's also interesting that we use behavior trees and the Unreal Mutant system to create an autoplay mode where the player, the character you control, can actually wander around the level and kill and defeat enemies and basically play the game by itself. It's pretty interesting to see that. And of course, there's the sample comes with interesting content on how developers should be really decide and when to use AI tests for behavior trees and when to use AI services. The case that we have there is pretty interesting for developers to look at the sample and see and easily find out why we made some decisions there. We also had some deep, I wouldn't say deep, but some interesting work with UMG and UI. Jim Brown helped us a lot with the UX side of things for this project. But there are some interesting examples on how to use UMG to properly design an inventory system and to use that for reuse of widget blueprints. That's really, really important when you're designing like that. And how we combine that with both the ability systems and the asset manager to create a completely, how can I say, dynamic UI for the inventory and for the store system. We have many plans for that for the future. We want that. We want to be able to extend the inventory, the character management system in the future. But for now, that's a really simple, really interesting project that developers can look at and use as example or even as a basis for their own games.
So I'm gonna, if you can kick over to the monitor real quick, I wanna play the game, so give everybody kind of an idea of what's going on. So we have a little intro cinematic, and little monsters, they're making some noise. All right, so like Paulo said, we have a full UI, so we have, you know, different weapons. And what he said about being dynamic is, the cool thing is if we make a new weapon type, like, you know, say we make like, I don't know, a war sledgehammer or something like that, we don't actually need to go into this UMG widget and update. It will find that and put it right here with the icon that we specify, the amount of souls that it will cost. You know, the same thing goes for potions. We've got some skills over here. We also have our options menu, so you can see we got some options. The other cool thing that this sample shows you how to do is it shows you how to properly scale your UI. So it can run on, you know, iPhone 6 and iPhone 7 and an iPad and an iPad Pro and an iPad Pro Plus and the iPad 4 Mini, and there's so many devices out there. And let's see, we'll do a little special move. Boom, boom. So we got some potions. I can come in here and, you know, change to my health potion. And now my health will be restored. So this is the project, and you can get it on the iOS store, you can get it on the Google Play Store, and you can download it from the Unreal Engine Marketplace. Just search for Action RPG. And we have lots of plans for this. You know, a lot of our other sample content kind of comes out and then it gets updated, but it doesn't get improved upon. And we want to improve upon this project by adding, you know, more weapons, doing more documentation that shows how to use more parts of the ability system. You know, because it's just kind of scratching the surface of what we can do. And kind of with that, I'll let kind of Ben have it from here.
Yeah.
I'll give you the
sure.
controls if you'd like.
Yeah, so I'm Ben. I'm a programmer at Epic. I've been here for kind of a long time. Like I say, about 8 years now. So
long time.
Yeah, my background is I started working on Gears 3, and then I was involved in a lot of the early UE4 work, transitioning from UE3 to UE4, and then I was on the Fortnite team for lots of years. And the reason I'm involved here is that I'm currently on what's called the Gameplay Framework team at Epic. And that's the team that sits between the very engine-y things like rendering and then the very game-specific things. So we will often be working on Fortnite directly, or we'll be just working on things for licensees. So I kind of directly split between being gameplay programmer and being an engine programmer. So that made a lot of sense for me to work on the action RPG sample, because the framework team had like talked about it before, and we didn't really have a good sample that kind of like represented the modern way of making a game. A lot of our samples were from earlier in the UE4 development, from like 4.0, like a shooter game. Like a shooter game is a really good sample, but it's a sample for a certain type of game. So we wanted to make a sample that's like more representing the way that like Fortnite and Paragon actually got built. And that's sort of why action RPG made sense for us. I guess I'll talk a little bit about like that split between Blueprint and C++, because there's a few questions about that, and it comes up a lot.
It's a hugely widely debated topic.
Yeah, so actually, I wrote up a little document for the release of this. It's in the Action RPG section. That's kind of, I forget what we called it, but it's like balancing C++ and Blueprint.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's called.
Yeah,
actually.
so it's kind of like trying to talk through like when you want to use C++, when you want to use Blueprint. Because when you're making a game, when you're making a medium to large game, which I would define as a team size of, I don't know, 10 or 15 and larger, you're almost certainly going to want to do some stuff in C++. And it's good to talk about like what things make sense to do where. And when you're making something like an RPG, I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of build your like foundational systems in C++. Like sort of like the general rule we use internally is like, it's like kind of how generic is the system. If there's a lot of like very specific things you're doing, like, you know, like go here, do this, then do that thing, then Blueprint or even Sequence are a really good way to do that. But when you're building like a foundational system, which in our case, in Action RPG, is something like doing damage or having inventory, it's pretty difficult to do that in Blueprint in a way that can be maintainable for a long period of time. Because when you make things in Blueprint, it's a little easier to kind of put things in sort of like more natural, but like harder to, it's easier to get things off the ground in Blueprint, but sometimes it can be hard to understand how the whole system is working.
Or it could run a little slower.
Uh-huh.
It said or it can run a little slower.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, that's the other reason. The other big reason to do C++ is just pure performance. Any system that's like run enough where it's going to be a problem, especially on like a console or a mobile platform, then doing it in C++ starts to make sense for like purely just like performance reasons. But most of the stuff in Action RPG isn't about that. It's more like these are the kind of things that I would normally do in C++ even if there was no performance problems. So some of the stuff for Action RPG that are in C++ is one, the save game system is in C++. Because this is one of those things that you need to be really careful with. Because if you have a game that you're going to support for, let's say, a year, where you add new patches and you make new updates, if you do a save game system in Blueprint only, you can run into problems where a designer might decide to like change one of the names of one of the variables in the thing you're saving, and that will actually cause your existing players to lose their data because that name is now changed. There are ways you can deal with that. Like there are some examples of that in the code, but those are the kind of things that are hard to solve in Blueprint. So any system that's going to need to be maintained for a long period of time is usually a good candidate for C++. The other big, so the save game system's in C++. The inventory system is tied very tightly to the save game system. That also uses the asset manager, which is actually a piece of technology that I wrote over the last 2 years. It came out of demands on the Fortnite team, where Fortnite's a very large game where there's like hundreds of items. And there wasn't really any system built into UE4 to allow you to like load and handle things that weren't like explicitly referenced. Because like it's kind of like the basic way UE4 works is you have a map and you place things in the map. For things like the asset manager, there's no map to place it in because you could have one of 5 swords. So in the action RPG example, there's no reference to those swords anywhere in the map. They get pulled in from the asset manager. And never mind. Basically the asset manager is good for that kind of like programmatic stuff. And then the inventory ties into the asset manager because everything that can be saved in your inventory is sort of like has its own like top level definition in the asset manager. So each sword has its own little unique name. And sort of like one of the reasons we did that is there's actually like a back end to Fortnite and to most larger games. So the asset manager is kind of like the thing that sits between the sort of like online back end and then the actual game. So the asset manager is kind of designed to be like this kind of like interface layer between different parts of your system and to handle things like loading and just like there's just a lot of complicated stuff that happens when you get to a larger game. Whenever your game can't all be in memory at once, that's when you're going to have to probably use something like the asset manager to deal with it. The other big system that the action RPG uses is the ability system. Just to give a little bit of background of where that came from, I think it started maybe 3 or 4 years ago when the gameplay programmers on the Fortnite team and the gameplay programmers on the Paragon team realized they were like kind of wasting time implementing the same things. Because both Paragon and Fortnite had combat. And there was a lot of like redundant work being done. So a lot of us got together and decided, hey, we should build one unified system, put it into the engine properly, and then use it in both Paragon and Fortnite. And it started out in a very experimental form. It's now quasi-experimental. I think it's most of it is ready for use, and the action RPG uses all of the parts of the ability system that I would say I'm fully confident in any game using. But yeah, but if you look at the details of the system, it is originally designed to satisfy the gameplay programmers on the Fortnite team and the Paragon team, and it kind of came the secondary benefit of moving it into the engine. But that's why it's a little bit messier than some of the other code. The other thing I would say about the ability system is there's some documentation online that we now have, but to understand the ability system, it helps if you've played a somewhat complicated RPG, such as a Diablo 3 or like a World of Warcraft, because a lot of the design of the ability system came about for us trying to help out designers who had worked on similar games to that. So there's basically systems designers. It's like sort of like a subsection of designers. And we built the ability system to kind of work with them. And that's really good because when you're making a larger game, you're going to have the people who are going to be implementing the actual abilities going on are probably going to be designers or blueprinty type people and not so much individual programmers. I think that's kind of like my summary of the ability system. You guys almost have more summary stuff they want to talk through?
So one thing that I'd like to point out about the sample is there are going to be some things that are really, really simple, making a new ability, adding a new weapon. But once you try to add, some more, look at the code and things like that, it starts to ramp up very quickly in its complexity. So don't let that discourage you from, this is a real, this is not something that we just made to kind of show people, hey, this is how you would do this. No, this is the exact system that's used, again, in Fortnite and Paragon, and it's very complex. So, don't get discouraged if you don't fully understand it or anything like that. It is a very complex system, and it's always changing and evolving.
Yeah, I think I would say this sample is kind of meant to represent how you would take a prototype, which Sam already mentioned, because this actually kind of did start out as a prototype. The version of this 6 months ago was entirely in Blueprint and was designed just to show off some of the more like mobile-friendly features.
And the UI, like how you would do a UI for an RPG on a higher-end mobile phone.
Yeah, but then honestly, that's how most games start out. Like in a larger studio or even like in a student project, you're going to kind of screw around in like prototype, get some stuff going, see how you like it, and then you want it to turn into a real game. And the action RPG sample is kind of an example of how you would do that. So that's kind of our goal there.
Yeah, kind of show behind the scenes a little bit about how game development goes, and it's a constant battle. You're always fighting. Something is either always breaking, or you figured out something. Now you have to make a design change. There's always some stuff. You don't just all of a sudden we sit at our desks, and then in 6 months, out comes the product. There's a lot of trials and tribulations and dead ends and things like that go into this.
Yeah, and also like, the sample's not perfect. We know that, and we're going to fix some of the stuff as we go on. But also, no actual game is perfect either. So
Yep.
like, it's just kind of how this works.
And we're all human, so we know that there are some issues, but we wanted to show you that, hey, we have a plan, and sometimes you don't have the chance to fix stuff. I know one of the questions was, why didn't we use the gameplay cues system? And simply, the stuff was working, and we had to get the ability system out, and if it's not broken, kind of don't fix it. If it works just fine for what you need, then that's perfect, and if it's shippable, it's shippable.
Yeah, to that specific point, gameplay cues are a system that I would recommend many people use. It's a well-developed system in the ability system, and both Fortnite and Paragon used it very heavily. It just turns out that basically, through combination of like scheduling, like Sam mentions, and also just the design of the game, the specific abilities that have been like designed for action RPG didn't need gameplay cues.
But we will definitely look into putting that in there.
Yeah, because I'm actually working on some stuff for Fortnite right now that actually may make it easier to use gameplay cues in the future. So I'm thinking about how to put an example gameplay cue into back-end action RPG. So it will probably happen at some point. I'm not sure when. But gameplay cues are a well-supported system, and I recommend people use them.
Paulo, you got anything that you'd like to add, bud?
Yeah, just want to confirm that at some point the flexibility of the project may look a little bit overwhelming, but don't give up. Just try to go over things slowly, and at some point you will understand the reasons behind the decisions that we made. And we definitely want to improve some stuff, improve some of the ways, some of the decisions that we made on implementing some stuff, and even improving the usage of the sample project itself. We definitely want to give another pass on our organization, our functions, and events, and probably even some file asset locations, asset organization in terms of folders and everything, just to make sure that people can easily find what they're looking for when they actually want to see how one thing was made in this project, and also try to improve quality of life when they want to port content or parts of the code from our sample maybe to their own projects. Of course, that's not applicable to anything, to a lot of things, but some stuff you can actually move from a project to another, and that's one thing that we will try to improve with time.
Yep.
Yeah, should we dive into some of the more
specific
questions?
let's go into some more of the specific questions.
Okay.
Unless is there anything in the chat?
They're dropping in more questions, but
Okay.
the other ones are also relevant, so we can start there. and
Yeah,
yeah.
catch
we'll just
up
go
back up.
through. There's a lot of ability system questions, so I'm going to try to do a chunk of those. So we already mentioned gameplay cues. There's a few other features in the ability system that the example is not using. One of them is there's a system for binding input, and that's a good system that actually Paragon used extensively. It just didn't make much sense for a mobile-first game because the input is a little different there. So the input system, there's a lot of different ways to do that. There's no right way to do input in the ability system. So I went with the simplest method, which is just kind of like, there's actually two ways it executes. One is you just use tags, and the other one is it actually binds to inventory slots. The inventory slot method is actually very similar to the way Fortnite works, because Fortnite also has a selectable inventory. But Paragon used the input binding system very heavily, and it worked well for them. So there's no right way to do input. Related to that, there's the targeting actors. That's probably the one area of the ability system currently that's kind of not ready for full time, for like prime time, especially in a mobile project. The way that the sort of sample targeting actors work is it actually spawns a brand new actor every time you use an ability. And that is too heavyweight for mobile. You don't want to be spawning new actors every time you hit someone with a sword. So that's sort of why I didn't use that system. That's an example of where the Fortnite and Paragon versions of that targeting system are actually very complicated. So I couldn't pull them out into the sample in a clean way. a lot of it has to do with the fact that they use predictive targeting. And when you get into predictive targeting, it's very game specific. So like the Fortnite targeting is actually quite different from the Paragon targeting, because Fortnite is more of a shooter than Paragon was. So in Fortnite, it's kind of like the targeting is kind of like any other first-person shooter, where you actually like do like you kind of do like a lot of the sort of traces and sort of the. I'm sorry, I'm not very. Anyway, it's more like a first-person shooter. So we get a first-person shooter targeting system that kind of like feeds into the ability system. Whereas Paragon actually did use a version of the targeting actors, but they used a much like different version that was set up for Paragon's like very specific targeting setup. Because Paragon targets like a MOBA where you have kind of like a actual physical cursor that you move around, and that's sort of where the targeting came from. So I would say that targeting is an area where you're probably going to have to write a fair amount of your own code if you're not doing something very simple. Like the action RPG example, I think works just fine for any sort of Diablo-like game, because it just does like some very simple traces and such. So if you're making any sort of like Diablo game, I think you're good to go with what's an action RPG. If you're doing more complicated sort of like multiplayer stuff, you're probably going to have to write your own code. Another chunk of questions here about sort of the way I do damage. The damage calculations in the action RPG are kind of more meant to be an example. So basically you have a health attribute and then you have a damage attribute. The damage attribute is sort of like a temporary attribute that you compute while you're doing damage, and then that turns into removing health. The reason we did that is that it makes the math a little simpler when you have like buffs and debuffs. Because we found while working on Fortnite that when you have a complicated damage formula, it's much easier to think about it in terms of like positive damage instead of negative health. Just the math works out easier for designers. So that's sort of the way it worked out. It's the actual formula is just an example. Like every game will probably have a different formula. It depends on how much you want to do for buffs and debuffs and just like what sort of like system you're doing. So take that as an example, but you can do damage however you want. There's so many ways to do damage, and the Fortnite damage calculation is actually very complicated. So there's just a lot of flexibility the system gives you and how you want to handle it. Then there's some general questions here about sort of like Fortnite and sort of like how does Fortnite use the ability system? Like what is the future of the ability system? So Fortnite uses the ability system very heavily. So every time you do damage in Fortnite, it uses the ability system. It's heavily integrated into the game. It seems to perform pretty well. Like we've done a lot of performance improvements over the last year to work on getting the Battle Royale working. I would say generally we haven't had too many problems with the actual application of damage or buffs or debuffs using the ability system. We have had problems with individual abilities, because one of the benefits of the ability system is it gives designers the ability to do whatever they want to in Blueprint, and sometimes they would do expensive things in Blueprint, and we would have to tell them that no, you can't do like 50 traces every frame just so the like effect looks good. So
why not?
I'm just doing circle traces.
Yes. So yes, obviously any system like the ability system, you can totally abuse it and make it do bad things. But the ability system is sort of gives us like a framework to kind of to sort of like have best practices where we can say, don't do these types of things, do these types of things. So the ability system has been actually, I think, pretty helpful for getting performance on Fortnite in a good position. As for where the system's going in the future, right now we're mostly focused on Fortnite support. So like I said, the ability system is used a lot in Fortnite. We're adding new features to Fortnite. So like I'm working on some stuff for gameplay cues that has to do with just sort of like use cases that came out of Fortnite, but I'm probably going to port some of that back to the engine.
And then it'll come back into Action
RPG
and then if appropriate.
And then I plan to bring it into Action RPG when that makes sense. But we're not really adding like a bunch of like new top level features to the ability system right now. That's sort of why we decided that now is a good time to write up documentation and like release it in quotes, because it's in a pretty good spot right now. We're not going to be like redoing this version of it a crazily amount in the next year or two. So,
Ha! You say that now.
anything could change. I'm not saying that will happen. I'm saying that seems to be where we're headed. But like I said, things are constantly. I mean,
That's the nature of game design. Everything changes on its head. So, but like Ben said, it's pretty stable, and it's a good spot where we feel comfortable that it's not going to be making these huge steps backwards, or we won't be able to change the documentation or the sample with make it somewhat easy.
Yep. There's some other related questions that popped up here. So yeah, one of the more complicated things, like I mentioned, is sort of like prediction and multiplayer networking. Action RPG doesn't get into that. It's just because it's how complicated it is. The broad method we use on Fortnite, and I think is a good method, is we drive things off montages a lot. So we basically, a lot of the effects and things will get played from the montage, and then the montage will get activated from the ability. It's actually very similar to how Action RPG works. The only difference is that there's a custom like Fortnite networking class in the middle that handles like the targeting, replication, and other sorts of stuff. But no, I think the model in Action RPG is a pretty good model, but you're going to have to expand it out to handle networking. We've talked about maybe doing that for Action RPG in the future. I'm not sure if that's going to we have had discussions. It's a complicated question.
It adds a lot of overhead. We'd have to do a lot of refactoring because that wasn't really how it was built from the get-go.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can't shoehorn things into your project. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, that's one of those cases where like you can make a game using the ability system with like light programming if you making a single player game. If you're making a multiplayer game with like good feeling multiplayer, you're going to need pretty heavy programming. And it's unclear to us what we want to do with the sample, whether we want to keep it a little simpler or go all the way. So we're talking about it, but I'm not sure yet how we'll end up there.
We'll approach that bridge when we come to it.
Any other ability stuff? Okay, there's one question here about Action RPG specifically, about why things are done in Blueprint. Yes. So a lot of the stuff with the Action RPG sort of like combat behavior is specifically because it started out as a Blueprint prototype. So there are some things in the pawn and the player controller that in a game like Fortnite would be in native, but in Action RPG are in Blueprint. I don't think there's anything wrong with that for the scale of the kind of game you're making with Action RPG, but those are some of the things that you might want to move into C++ if you're making a larger game. So there's no like right answer for that. There's just different options for that. And like I said, our Action RPG is kind of a starting point. I would describe it as like 50% along the way from turning a prototype into a fully real game.
Yeah.
Like it's not all the way there, but it's like pretty far along. So yeah, you would have to evaluate that for your own game. I think that's all the ability ones. Oh, no, one more. There's a question about different ways of like allocating attributes. There's different ways to do that. One of the things about attribute sets is they have to be in native right now. That's just kind of like because of how the division developed from the Fortnite and the Paragon team. There's other ways you can do that, and sort of like the way I allocate the default stats, that's just one of like 5 different methods. But like there's a lot of different ways to initialize default data. We actually tried a few different ones on Fortnite and Paragon. I don't think there's like a right answer for that. There's like the system's pretty flexible, so there's a lot of different ways to like set the initial HP for a player or an enemy. I think that's
I see a lot of questions about doing something for the asset.
Yeah.
The asset manager. We had stuff. I have some stuff planned, but I'll see what I can do about maybe putting that documentation further up and the further up in the queue to get something out a little sooner to break things down. Because we have a lot of documentation planned for the systems that we have in there. Just we wanted to get the ability stuff out first, and then we'll move on.
The asset manager itself there's some documentation for the asset manager over in the programming docs that goes through sort of like the general way you use it. The asset manager, again, is meant to be pretty flexible, so there's a lot of ways to use it. Like Battle Breakers, which is one of our mobile titles, uses a lot of other things from the asset manager, and that's kind of how it handles like figuring out which assets should be in memory at a certain point in gameplay. I actually wrote a blog about that. If you look at the Unreal blog,
Oh, okay.
talking about sort of like how Battle Breakers use the asset manager. So that might give you guys some hints on how to do that. If you check the Unreal blog, it should be there. Just look for Battle Breakers.
Let's see if I can pull it up.
Yeah, if you can link it, that'd be good.
Anything else?
Yeah, there's some other ones in here about the asset manager.
Is it the chunked downloading one?
Yeah, that one. Yeah, yeah. The chunk downloading blog has some information about the asset manager.
There you go.
Do you know if Paragon used behavior trees for AI? I have no
pretty,
idea.
I'm pretty sure it did. I don't remember. So there's a question specifically about Paragon AI. None of us here are an expert on that.
Yeah,
So,
it's not something I know a lot about.
my understanding is that it used similar systems it definitely used behavior trees. I don't actually know the details about that one, so that may be more of a question for more of the Paragon guys if they're ever around. Back to the asset manager. Okay, there's a few different questions about the asset manager. I'm just going to go to the top and go down. Okay. Okay. There's a question here about using the asset manager for sort of like automatically generated assets. So in Action RPG, the designers hand built all of the assets. There's like 5 swords. This works just fine for most games. Actually, Fortnite is done that way. So Fortnite has a lot of items, but all of the items are in fact handmade by designers. A lot of that has to do with sort of like how much custom logic there is in the items. Like the Fortnite items tend to be very custom. If you're making a game that just had like a lot of different stat-based items and you wanted to like randomly configure them, then you have a few different options. We actually do a little bit of that in Fortnite, and the way we do that is basically all the like modifiers live in the asset manager's like potential modifiers. So you have like a plus 10% damage modifier. You have a on fire modifier. So all of those are handled by the asset manager, and so it knows about all the possibilities. And then we have basically some like data tables that give the percentage chance of each of those things happening. And then at runtime, we combine those things together. And so like the item instance is a custom thing that's like at runtime. And that actually gets like saved to the backend database. But all the like components of it, those are each their own thing in the asset manager. And we also use some of the more advanced asset manager features, which is things called bundles, to allow you to say we have a soft reference from the item into sort of like the item's sound package or something like that. And because Fortnite's a huge game, you don't want to load all the things at once. So we basically load all of the like basic item definitions all the time, but then we stream in and out the graphics and sound representations. So this allows us to kind of have more items than you could ever need, but then you can stream in and out. But the other thing you can do, we do sometimes in Fortnite, and other games do this as well, is you can also write scripts to generate assets for you. So we have some stuff in the single-player part of Fortnite where there's just a bunch of different like modifiers that get applied from people in your the people you put in your tree. Anyway, so for that, there's actually a script that actually generates a lot of those assets from one Excel document. And how you want to do that is up to you. Like that's data tables are great for that. Like data tables are set up for importing from CSV or JSON. We use Excel internally with some like macros that like export CSVs from Excel. I know a lot of other studios just have their own JSON Python, like Python to JSON pipeline. Again, there's a lot of ways to do that. So yeah, the asset manager is designed as like a system that you're going to need to build on top of. Like it's sort of meant to be like a central starting point, but you're going to have to write a lot of game-specific code if you're doing something like complicated.
They have a lot of questions.
Yes. Okay. There's a question here about using the asset manager for DLC. Yeah, so there's currently, that is not something that's built in. Sorry, the question is about sort of like using the asset manager to download and install DLC at runtime. This is not something that we have support for in the engine. We've talked about doing it. It's not something that our internal games need right now, so it hasn't been a priority. but it's definitely a thing you can write. And there's a lot of different, again, it kind of ties into the general question about how to do like programmatic items. But yeah, the asset manager is a good system to start from and then build on top of that. Because you'll see, and like Battlebrickers is sort of doing that, but not all the way. Most of our games right now have like we tend to like ship out like a catalog with every new client update, and that has all the information about stuff. But there's other ways to do that. Like there's other systems. Just that's just how it's built up so far in our internal games.
Seems to be two other questions about Blueprint versus C++.
Yeah, I think we covered most of that. Oh, okay. No.
So what?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. There's another page. Okay.
Oh.
Surprise!
Aha.
There's even more questions. They have so many for you.
I need to read this real fast. Do you have anything you want to talk about?
Just there was a couple questions that I saw above about doing, why we chose to do Blueprint and C++. Again, this probably could have been built using blueprints, but the thing is that this is a relatively small sample. So as it scales in complexity, as we start adding more and more abilities, as we start adding more and more items, it just starts to add more complexity to the game, especially since we're trying to target higher-end mobile devices. Any type of speed up that we can get anywhere, whether that's a rendering performance, memory performance, or actual compiled game code performance, we're going to want to take. And that's why we moved the damage system into C++. It's just going to be faster. It also allows things like bin to make a little bit quicker changes. We can get a new build in. I think there was another question about why we didn't use only what you, include only what you use for C++ compiled options. The reason is we forgot because the game compiled so quickly. Like, those are just things that happen. There might be some things that we didn't necessarily need to use at the time because the game was working the way that it is. Yeah. And, we had deadlines where we had to meet them. So, like, sometimes when it's the 12th hour and you're ready to, the game has to get shipped, you're going to start cutting stuff and pulling things out so that you can make sure that you hit your deadlines, because your bosses really don't like it when you're like, I need a little bit more time. Right. They're like, I gave you plenty of time.
Right. This was more as an example of actual game development.
Yes.
So as opposed to being like a perfect 100%, like in an ideal world, this is what your game would look like. It's more of we've gone from prototype to existing game in a format that is still shippable, still very playable and optimized, and is a good experience. But, if we had 5 years to work on it and just build it in the exact way, that's not what this is.
There's some very specific questions in here about the ability system that are kind of hard to cover in this format. They probably be better as Answer Hub or UDN questions. But I would say in general, the approach that we're using in Action RPG is pretty similar to the way the Fortnite works. But again, the logic to take it out and be like client predicted is hard to describe in a short period of time. But I would say the assets are very similar to the way that Fortnite works. So Fortnite actually does have montages with sort of like sections where you might do a combo. That's actually how the melee works in Fortnite. It's the same way. The main difference is that, like I said, there's a lot of logic in the middle for predicting. So it's kind of hard to describe that quickly. There were a few questions about, there's a dialogue question here. Yeah, so there's some systems like dialogue, sort of like a character dialogue, where there's no like built-in engine solution for that. And I don't think anything is planned anytime that I'm aware of. It's one of those systems where it's so different game to game that it's pretty hard to write a generic one. So we don't try to do systems like that. And like, there's some other like widget blueprint questions down here. I don't know if you know this one at all, Sam.
Widget blueprints. Paul, I'm going to read this out loud because you might know it as well. So for widget blueprints, I want to make a tab menu where you press a button and a whole list of options shows up. but could not find the right setup or UMG components for it.
Tab menu. I'm pretty sure that we have one of our built-in classes, built-in widgets that you are able to create tab menus. It's hard to say that by in this format, but I'm pretty sure that we have a tab menu, and that probably you should be able to hook events or buttons, even a simple widget button to change the tab. You're probably accessing the tab by number, by index, like 0, 1, 2. I'm pretty sure that we have something like that. If we don't, yeah, that probably we need to be written from scratch. The overlay widget, overlay panel could work because it literally allows you to stack widgets on top of each other, and we basically will have to manage what widget was in front of the user at a specific point in time. But yeah, we have a widget switcher that you can use for that, so that should work, I think.
Okay. Let me try with a few more of these asset manager questions. So basically the question is like, is the asset manager a good starting point for a moddable game? Yes, the asset manager is a good starting point for a moddable game. But like I said, it's not all the way there. So you're probably going to have to do your own custom work on top of it. And let's see here. There's a few other questions. Yeah, someone wants to integrate an SQLite database with the asset manager. I thought about doing that myself. I think that's a good idea because you could basically, the asset manager, like sort of like memory implementation of it can come from a variety of different sources. So I think that's definitely worth exploring. But again, there's no support for that built into the engine. So you'd have to look into a third-party solution for that. But that's something I would definitely be looking into if I was making a larger game. There's a few different performance questions. Getting a little more specific, like, would it be okay to create and destroy characters when they spawn and die? Generally, yes. We're actually talking about this on Fortnite now. There's definitely overhead in spawning and destroying things. One of the big things we do on Fortnite is we don't spawn ability system components for all of the stuff in the world until you actually interact with it. Because in Fortnite, you can literally destroy anything in the world. So when you first hit a wall piece, we actually spawn an ability system component at that point, and then it becomes a real like object. But until you hit it, it's like totally cheap. So I think if you're making like a really large scale game like an RTS or something, you may need to do something like that. Like for an RTS, you may not want to have individual ability system components for every single model. You may want to have like one for the entire unit, as an example, or something like that.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so I do feel like the ability system should scale just fine to a traditional RTS style game. Yeah, as long as it's, it shouldn't be a big deal. There was one more performance question. Never mind. Okay, there's a few more inventory questions. About one question about how does Fortnite do inventory? So Fortnite does inventory fairly similar to the way that Action RPG does it. There are some differences because of replication and sort of historical way that inventory evolved in Fortnite. But yes, every item in Fortnite, again, there's an instance of it, and then there's like a template. And the template are all primary assets. And the instance, again, has information about the modifiers that were added to it. And we've had to do a fair amount of work to make that efficient because items get big. There's a lot of information in them. But yeah, no, it's pretty similar to Action RPG, and we do heavily use the asset manager in the inventory system. There's a lot of a lot of these questions are related again. I think some of the very specific questions are probably better saved for text.
Yeah. Is there more?
I think that's
just keeps going.
Okay. Okay. There's a general question about sort of like ability blueprint, C++, and robo recall. Yeah. So robo recall is not entirely blueprint. There actually are several base level systems that were moved into C++. That's an example of like a team right on the size margin where like going heavy blueprint makes a lot of sense. It was a pretty small team, and a lot of the highest contributors were very comfortable with blueprints. So Robo Recall is definitely our like most blueprint heavy game of any game we've made internally. That's also why it heavily uses the blueprint nativization feature. It really depends on what your team is at that point. So Robo Recall is also more of a game where we kind of did it once and then it's not being updated as actively as something like Fortnite is. So yeah, there are concerns for that, but I mean, it has to do with individual teams. The engine can totally support a mostly blueprint game, but again, there are certain aspects of Robo Recall that are native for performance. Also, we heavily use the nativization feature. Okay.
I think most of it was actually due to the challenge that they had to run at 90 FPS.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're making a VR game, you're going to have to be using either heavy C++ or something like nativization. And nativization is a really good solution for most cases. Blueprint nativization is a tricky process, and just because of how complicated it is, for certain types of games, it may not be appropriate. It really has to do with how much weird stuff your game is doing. And Robo Recall is relatively not weird. It wasn't that weird of a game. Like, things made sense in it. But yeah, there's a lot of different options. There's an actual implementation question about slow motion. I think Paulo can maybe answer that. Yeah, question is, how do you do the slow motion on the attacks?
We literally use time dilation on. We have on the montages, the few montages, the combo ends, and some of the skills. We literally have an in notify that starts and ends a time dilation on the whole simulation. It's cool because we can literally set the beginning and the starting point within the end montage. So that's literally, we leave that to the artist. So when they want to give some emphasis to some parts of the animation, some parts of the skill or the attack or whatever, we also use that. And there's a little bit of a trick. If you've been to most of the action games, they try to, every time the player hits with an attack, every time an attack hits an enemy, you literally try to pause the screen or pause the simulation for just a little bit, like a half a second, or maybe even less than half of a second, just to give a little bit more impact sensation to the player. If you look at even modern games, like they're doing that with animations, even using physics for that. And in action RPG, we literally also use time dilation for that. So every time that every time you hit an attack with an enemy, the game slow down just a little bit for like a tenth or a fifth of a second, just to give you a little bit of the impact sensation.
Yeah, I would say also that that's one of those things that that might be a better thing for C++ at some point. Things like that. We use some of that in Fortnite. You can even do a limited version of that where you only slow the animation down of the particular enemy that's involved, and that's better for multiplayer games. Like, you can't slow the whole world down in a multiplayer game. So
it'd be cool if you could.
Yes.
But yeah, I think there's a lot.
That would be great.
Yeah, but that's a good example of how you can get the feel for those kind of things. I don't think I have anything I need to address.
Yeah, we can get the list of the questions from Amanda and go through because it seems like a lot of these are very specific, and some of them are probably going to be hard to explain without like some type of example,
Like
or
an example
something like
project.
that.
I wonder if we could maybe link to some Answer Hub questions from the thread or something. I guess we could talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, we could figure that out.
Yeah, but maybe because some of these are good. Some of these are better in Answer Hub because then people can chime in from their own experiences. Because there's no right way to do a lot of these things. So I think we can talk about this later.
And we've discussed as far as like the gameplay ability system, of maybe having a stream that's a little more dedicated to that, and at least sort of introducing it. And so we know you all have a lot of questions regarding that, and so that may be addressed a little better in like a future thing. At least some of, not necessarily the specific questions, but
We could
at
talk
least
about
getting
it,
you
yeah.
to.
We could have one that's
surface into it.
specifically around the gameplay ability. system.
There's a cluster of like, how do you make this multiplayer? And that's a hard question that is going to be difficult to go into a stream, but we can definitely talk about the right way to approach that. There is some discussion online about that. I know there's some on UDN as well, but it's not in a central place, so we should definitely talk about that.
Okay.
But other than that, I think that's all the ones I see.
Yeah. There was one thing that I wanted to add. Now I forgot what it was, so I'll remember it when we're done.
Maybe. Yeah, once we walk out, you'll be.
Yeah, it's bugging me now. I can't remember what it was. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Like we said, we know the sample is not in a perfect state just yet. We're going to work very hard to get it there and document kind of our progress along the way. Kind of the decisions that we made, things that went wrong, things that went right. So, kind of lifting the cover back a little bit so people can see, this is a challenging thing to do. And we didn't just, press a button and the game came out. There's a lot that went into it. And we want to share that with everybody in the community.
Make game button?
It's right next to the Make MMO button.
Right.
It just makes your computer run out of memory.
Sounds about right. Is there anything you wanted to add, Paulo?
No, just that. Please enjoy the project. Use it whenever you want it as a base for your next games, or maybe try to extract a part of it and try to integrate it to your game. And of course, that if you have any questions, we're here to try to help.
Yeah, post to the forums. I read the forums. We have, I think, we don't have an action RPG section in there, but I'm sure we can
Not yet, but
figure
we
that
could.
out.
Is there a
We can make
thread
that
for
happen.
this stream?
Yeah,
Is a good place to have questions?
there's a thread for this stream.
Yeah, so we can either toss some of the questions from here can put there, or if it's worthwhile and you guys want to dive in, we can do an action RPG specific thread that
Okay, we can talk
questions
about
could
that.
be.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, either
That
way,
would be
that-
cool.
I think it'd be good. Yeah, because I'm definitely gonna be following the forums for the next week or so. So I'll try to at least give answers to some of the more technical questions. But again, I do think Answer Hub is a good way to go for some of these.
yeah.
Yep.
All right. So, as we're wrapping up, I'm tossing a link to a survey. Let us know how we're doing, what kinds of things you would like to see in the future. We always want to know what topics you have lots of questions about, so it's really great for you to fill out the survey. Also, we're starting to hand out t-shirts for them, so if you fill it out and toss us your email, we'll pick one from each week and send some t-shirts out. So you might get some swanky. You can match all these. They were commenting that you all matched. You have the same
I think
one.
it's
and-
accidental. This is like
Oh, wow,
this is like
yeah.
a 3-year-old shirt, right?
Yeah,
This is not a new shirt.
No, that
this was just on
last
the
year?
first in the stack.
This was
Yeah.
last year, maybe.
That's how you can tell how long somebody's worked here by the t-shirts they have
Their
in their collection.
yeah, so that's, it might not be that one, but you'll get an engine shirt. And then always check for your local UE4 meetups. If you go to meetup.com/pro/Unreal Engine, find folks in your area that are doing cool things, show off your own projects, and if there isn't one, you can message us and start your own and bring people together making cool games and other things. As I mentioned on the news earlier, please submit your project to the Nvidia Edge program. We'd love to be sending a 1080 Ti your way to help your development. So if you've got some rad projects you're working on, Twitch, or we do it on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So check out our hub page for that. And if you want to have your video as part of the countdown, we had, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but we do, if you record like an hour or so of development, compress it down to a 5-minute video, we can include it on your countdown, toss up your logo so you can show off your game and your team. And it's a cool way to watch what you've been working on, and we just love seeing it all. So
Yeah, that was pretty cool to watch, actually.
yeah, email us at community@unrealengine.com if you have questions around that. thank you all again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us on the stream.
And then we will see you next
Thanks
week.
for
So
joining.
take
See
care,
ya.
guys.